Mom. Please, don't leave me here. I'm scared. Abigail's voice trembled, desperate and full of fear. Her small hands gripped the doorframe, her wide blue eyes pleading with her mother. But Jessica, her mother, stood there, unmoved, her face lined with exhaustion and frustration. Abigail, stop it. You're too old for this, Jessica replied, her voice tired, as if she had repeated the same thing 100 times. She brushed Abigail's hands away gently, adjusting her jacket as she prepared to leave. I need just one night, okay? You'll be fine. Abigail's heart sank as she watched her mother turn her back, stepping toward the door. She wasn't fine. She knew she wouldn't be fine. There was something in the house, something she couldn't explain but could always feel, watching her, waiting for the moment she was alone. Jessica paused at the door for a moment, her hand on the knob, hesitating. Her eyes softened for just a second, as though a part of her knew something wasn't right. But before she could change her mind, Mark's voice echoed from down the hall. Come on, Jess. We're going to be late, Mark called out, his tone impatient but calm, as it always was. Mark, Jessica's younger brother, was always well-groomed, his dark hair neatly slicked back, his clothes impeccable. His presence was commanding, always drawing Jessica into his plans. Tonight, he was leading her out the door once again. With a sigh, Jessica opened the door without another word. The door clicked shut behind her, leaving Abigail standing alone in the middle of the dark, empty house. That sound, the door closing, felt like the final seal of her fate. Abigail stood there, frozen in place, her heart pounding in her chest. The house was eerily quiet, the walls closing in around her, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered by the sound of floorboards creaking. Abigail's breath hitched in her throat, her small body stiffening with fear. She slowly turned toward the hallway, her eyes wide. Who's there? She whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was no answer, just the slow, deliberate creak of the floorboards, as though something, or someone, was moving just beyond her sight. Her heart raced as she backed away, her eyes darting around the shadowed corners of the room. She had felt this before, the cold, creeping sensation that something was watching her. Her throat tightened as she turned and bolted for her bedroom, slamming the door behind her. Her trembling hands fumbled with the lock until she finally managed to secure it. She stood there for a moment, leaning against the door, trying to calm her racing heart. It's just my imagination, she whispered to herself, but the words sounded hollow. She couldn't shake the feeling that the darkness was alive, that something was lurking just beyond the walls, waiting for her. Abigail moved to her bed, pulling her blanket tightly around her like a shield. She curled up, her knees tucked against her chest, her breath shallow and ragged. Tears streamed down her face as she whispered into the dark, Mom, please come back. But the house was silent. Empty. She was alone. The minutes dragged on like hours, the darkness growing heavier with every passing second. The shadows in her room twisted and stretched across the walls, like dark, grasping fingers. Abigail's eyes flickered to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed to gather, swirling into a darker shape. A figure. Silent. Watching. Her breath hitched as she squeezed her eyes shut, pulling the blanket over her head like she used to when she was little. But the figure was still there. It was always there, lurking in the corner of her mind, creeping closer with every second she spent alone. Suddenly, a loud bang shook the walls. Abigail jumped, her heart pounding in her chest. She threw the blanket off and ran to the window, hoping to see her mother's car pulling into the driveway, hoping that maybe, just maybe, Jessica had come back. But the street was empty. The only thing outside was the cold, dark night. She stepped away from the window, her heart sinking. And that's when she heard it, the whisper. Soft, slow, and chilling. It made her blood run cold. Abigail. The voice was low, almost a breath, but it sounded like it was right next to her. Abigail froze, her eyes wide with terror. She turned toward the door, her whole body shaking, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, closer this time. Abigail. It dragged out her name slowly, like it was playing with her, enjoying her fear. She backed up against the wall, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. Her mind screamed at her to move, to run, but her body wouldn't listen. Suddenly, there was another loud bang, this time from the hallway just outside her room. Her heart raced as she listened. The footsteps. They were back. Slow, deliberate, heavy. Each one louder than the last. Abigail's eyes darted to the door. The footsteps stopped right outside, the shadow of someone, or something, visible beneath the crack of the door. The handle jiggled, turning slowly. Abigail. The voice whispered again, soft but menacing, like it was just on the other side of the door. Come out. Abigail held her breath, her whole body trembling. She wanted to scream, but fear had stolen her voice. The door handle rattled again, harder this time, and then, suddenly, the door creaked open, the darkness from the hallway spilling into her room. She could barely breathe as she stared at the open doorway, her heart pounding in her chest. And then, she saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, tall and dark, its face hidden in the shadows. It didn't move, but Abigail could feel its eyes on her, cold and hungry. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to disappear into it, her body shaking violently with terror. The figure stepped forward, the air around it growing colder as it moved closer to her. Abigail's breath caught in her throat as its hand reached out toward her, long and dark, the shadow of its fingers stretching across the room, reaching for her. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, leaving Abigail alone in the deafening silence. She fell to the floor, her body limp with exhaustion, her breath ragged and uneven. Tears streamed down her face as she stared at the closed door, too scared to move, too terrified to cry out for help. She was alone. And she knew, deep down, that whatever was haunting her wasn't done yet. The hotel in Banff was supposed to be an escape, a place to breathe again, surrounded by the beauty of the mountains and lakes. But for Abigail, the towering peaks and serene landscapes only felt like the walls of another prison. She clung to her mother, hoping Jessica would stay close, hoping she wouldn't be left alone in the shadows again. But Jessica, once again, seemed distant, her attention always drawn away by Mark. Mark, the man with sharp eyes and a charming smile, always dressed in clean, perfectly pressed clothes. He had a way of controlling Jessica, nudging her thoughts and decisions as if they were his own. And when he spoke about Abigail, his words were always laced with impatience. She needs to grow up, he would say. You're coddling her, Jess. Let her be. Abigail knew that Mark didn't like her. He never said it outright, but she could feel it in the way he looked at her, in the way his smile never reached his eyes when he spoke to her. And now, in this strange hotel room, she felt trapped between her mother's indifference and Mark's coldness. The first night in the hotel was quiet, but the air felt thick with something Abigail couldn't explain. She couldn't sleep, her eyes darting to every corner of the room, watching the shadows dance on the walls as the dim light from the window flickered in the darkness. Hours passed, and Jessica had already fallen asleep. But Abigail couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The shadows seemed to move differently here, darker and more alive. She felt it again, the presence, the same one from her house, lurking in the corners, waiting for her. A soft sound broke the silence. A creak, almost too quiet to notice, came from the hallway. Abigail froze, her heart pounding. The sound was familiar, too familiar. She knew it was there, waiting just beyond the door. Without thinking, she slipped out of bed and tiptoed to the door, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. She turned it slowly, her heart racing as the door creaked open. The hallway outside was dimly lit but empty. She took a step into the hall, her bare feet cold on the wooden floor, and started to walk toward the lobby, hoping someone, anyone, would be awake. As she reached the elevator, a voice called out behind her, startling her. Abigail, where are you going? She spun around to see Mr. Davis, the older hotel employee who worked the night shift. His gray hair was neatly combed, and he wore a simple, formal uniform that seemed a bit too large for his thin frame. Mr. Davis was a quiet man, always serious, with eyes that seemed to see more than he let on. He had been kind to Abigail when they checked in, offering her a small smile, though he rarely smiled at anyone else. I couldn't sleep," Abigail whispered, her voice shaking. "I was just going to get some water." Mr. Davis narrowed his eyes, sensing that something was wrong. He stepped closer, his eyes softening slightly. "Is everything all right, miss?" he asked gently, his voice deep but comforting. Before Abigail could answer, a door down the hallway swung open, and Mark stormed out, his face twisted with irritation. He looked at Abigail, his expression darkening. "What are you doing out here, Abigail?" His voice was low and sharp, not at all like Mr. Davis's calm tone. Abigail felt her heart sink. She didn't have the words to explain the fear, the presence, the shadows. She could only shake her head, hoping it would all just disappear. "Get back to the room," Mark ordered, his voice hard. Without waiting for her to move, he grabbed her arm, his grip tight, and led her back toward the room. Mr. Davis stood still, watching with concern, his eyes lingering on Abigail's frightened face. Back in the room, Mark slammed the door behind them, his jaw clenched. "You can't keep doing this, running around at night," he muttered under his breath. "You're driving your mother crazy." Jessica, still half asleep, stirred but didn't open her eyes. Mark glanced at her, then turned back to Abigail. "She needs her rest. You need to stop causing problems." He paused for a moment, then added, "I'll show you what happens when you can't behave." Before Abigail could protest, Mark grabbed her arm again and marched her toward the closet. He opened the door and shoved her inside, his face twisted in anger. "No, please. Don't leave me in here." Abigail's voice cracked as she begged him, her heart pounding in her chest. The closet was small and dark, the air cold and heavy. The shadows inside felt even thicker, almost suffocating. But Mark ignored her pleas. He shut the door and locked it, leaving Abigail alone in the pitch-black space. "You'll stay in there until you learn to behave," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. Abigail's breath came in short, panicked gasps. She pressed herself against the door, pounding on it with her small fists. "Please, let me out, please." But her cries went unheard. The silence was deafening, the darkness overwhelming. Abigail could feel it again, the presence closer now, as if it was waiting for her in the shadows. She sank to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably, tears streaming down her face. Hours seemed to pass, though it could have been minutes. Time felt distorted in the suffocating dark. Every second stretched out, filled with the weight of her fear. And then, she heard it. A soft, quiet knock on the other side of the closet door. At first, she thought it was her imagination. But then, it came again, louder this time. Abigail's heart leapt in her chest, hope mixing with terror. She pressed her ear to the door, her breath shallow and uneven. "Abigail." A voice whispered, so faint she almost couldn't hear it. But it wasn't Mark's voice. It was someone else's. Someone, darker. She scrambled back, pressing herself into the farthest corner of the closet, her body shaking with fear. The shadows seemed to move around her, closing in, like they were alive. And then the whisper came again, louder, closer. "Abigail. I'm here." Her breath hitched, her whole body freezing as the closet door rattled slightly, as though someone, something, was on the other side, trying to get in. She couldn't move. She couldn't scream. And then the door flung open. "Mom." Abigail's scream was raw, echoing down the darkened hotel hallway. The closet door had flown open, but nothing, no one, stood on the other side. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stumbled out, gasping for breath, her mind racing. Mark had left the room earlier, his anger simmering beneath his cold exterior. He always knew how to hide it when Jessica was around. Now, with Mark gone and her mother still asleep, Abigail stood frozen in the doorway, her eyes darting to the shadows that lingered, as though something unseen still lurked just beyond her sight. Abigail's legs shook as she approached her mother's bed, where Jessica lay on her side, her body relaxed, lost in a dream. Abigail's breath came in ragged sobs as she reached out, gently shaking her mother's arm. "Mom, wake up please," Abigail's voice was a choked whisper, her fear barely contained. Her mother stirred, blinking her tired green eyes open. "What is it now, Abigail?" Jessica's voice was soft but laced with annoyance. She sat up, rubbing her face, trying to shake off the haze of sleep. Abigail stood there, trembling, her small hands twisted together. "The shadows, Mom, they're here again. I heard them, and the closet opened and..." Jessica sighed, her frustration breaking through. She rubbed her temples, eyes closed as if trying to shut out Abigail's words. "Abigail, we've talked about this. You're just imagining things." She leaned back against the pillows, her voice weary. "You're 9 years old now. You have to stop being so afraid." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "But I'm not imagining it, Mom. I'm not. I can feel them." Her voice cracked as she pleaded with her mother, hoping, begging, for her to understand. Jessica opened her eyes and finally looked at her daughter. But the look wasn't one of sympathy or understanding. It was one of impatience, of exhaustion. "Sweetheart, we're on vacation. I'm tired and I just need a break. From all of this, from everything." The words hung in the air, and Abigail's heart sank. A break from her. Jessica was telling her, without saying it directly, that Abigail was too much. Her fear, her needs, they were too much for her mother to handle. Abigail stood there, silent, her tears falling as Jessica turned away, pulling the covers over her shoulders. "Go back to bed, Abigail. There's nothing to be afraid of. Just please try to sleep." Abigail's legs felt like they would give out beneath her. She backed away from her mother's bed, her small body trembling with the weight of rejection, her fear growing colder, deeper. Her mother wouldn't believe her. Couldn't believe her. She was alone. Abigail returned to the small bed by the window, curling up beneath the blanket, staring at the shadows on the walls. Her mind raced, every noise, every flicker of movement setting her on edge. The presence in the room felt thick, heavy, like it was waiting for her to close her eyes. She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, trying to steady her breathing, trying to convince herself it was all in her mind. But deep down, she knew. It wasn't her imagination. It never was. The next day was quiet, but the tension between Abigail and her mother lingered. Jessica avoided Abigail's eyes, as if pretending nothing had happened. Mark was gone again, somewhere in the city, his absence a brief relief. But every time Abigail tried to bring up the shadows, the strange voice, Jessica brushed her off. By evening, they were sitting in the hotel lounge, the soft chatter of other guests filling the space. Jessica was sipping coffee, her eyes lost in thought, while Abigail sat quietly beside her, too afraid to say anything. That's when Mr. Davis appeared again. The older man approached their table with his usual stern expression, but his eyes softened when he looked at Abigail. He had seen the fear in her last night, and something in him stirred, a memory of long-buried guilt that had haunted him for years. "How are we this evening?" Mr. Davis asked politely, but his gaze lingered on Abigail, sensing that something was still wrong. Jessica glanced up, giving him a small, tired smile. "We're fine, thank you," she replied, her voice distant. Abigail looked at Mr. Davis, her lips trembling as she whispered, "I heard it again, last night," the voice. Jessica stiffened in her seat, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Abigail, please," she said through clenched teeth, her tone low with embarrassment. "Not this again." Mr. Davis frowned, glancing between Jessica and Abigail. He could see the tension, the unspoken frustration in Jessica's eyes. But more than that, he saw the genuine terror in Abigail's. It mirrored something in his own past, something he had long tried to forget. "Maybe she just needs some fresh air," Mr. Davis suggested gently, his voice kind. "A walk around the hotel grounds might help clear her mind." Jessica sighed, clearly worn down by everything. She nodded. Fine. We'll take a walk. They left the lounge together, stepping out into the crisp evening air. The hotel grounds were quiet, the towering mountains casting long shadows across the gardens. Abigail walked beside her mother, her eyes scanning the darkness, every shadow, every sound, making her heart race. As they walked, Jessica finally spoke, her voice soft but strained. I'm doing my best, Abigail. I really am. But I need you to understand, there's nothing there. You're safe. It's just your imagination. You have to trust me. Abigail stopped walking, tears welling up in her eyes. But, Mom, it's real. I can feel it. I don't want to be alone anymore. Jessica turned to face her daughter, her face filled with sadness. You're not alone, Abigail. I'm right here. But the words felt hollow. Because no matter what Jessica said, no matter how much she tried to convince herself, Abigail was alone. And as the shadows grew darker around them, that truth settled deep in her heart. That night, back in the room, Mark returned. His mood was lighter, but his eyes still carried that sharp edge whenever he looked at Abigail. He laughed and joked with Jessica, convincing her to relax, to let go of her worries. And so, Jessica did. She went to bed early, leaving Mark and Abigail alone in the living area. Mark's smile faded the moment Jessica closed the bedroom door. You're making things difficult, you know that, he said, his voice low and menacing. He didn't wait for Abigail to respond. You're stressing her out, always talking about your silly little fears. You need to stop. Abigail looked up at him, fear twisting in her chest. She didn't know what to say. Every word felt trapped in her throat. Mark leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you keep this up, you're going to regret it. Abigail's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in place. She couldn't run. She couldn't scream. All she could do was sit there, staring into Mark's cold eyes, as the darkness closed in around her. The hotel felt darker that night. The once warm, golden light in the hall seemed dimmer, and a deep chill crept through the building as though something sinister had settled in. Abigail lay awake in her bed, her small body curled tightly under the blanket. The shadows on the walls moved like they had a life of their own, twisting and flickering in unnatural patterns. She held her breath, too scared to close her eyes, terrified of what might happen if she let herself drift off to sleep. It had been hours since Mark's cruel words, and they still echoed in her mind. The way he had looked at her, the venom in his voice, it had left her frozen in fear. She knew he didn't care about her. Worse, he hated her. But there was something else now, something in his eyes that terrified her even more. He wanted her to suffer, and he wasn't going to stop until he had broken her. Abigail squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the fear, but it was everywhere. In the darkness, in the silence, in the shadows that never seemed to rest. And then, like a whisper in the back of her mind, she heard it again. Abigail. The voice was soft, barely audible but unmistakable. Her heart pounded in her chest as her eyes flew open, scanning the room. She couldn't see anything, but she could feel it, the same cold presence from before, lurking, watching. Her breathing quickened, her hands trembling as she clutched the blanket to her chest. Abigail. The voice was closer now, louder, creeping through the air like a chill that made her skin crawl. She threw off the blanket, her body shaking as she darted toward the door. She couldn't stay here, not alone. She crept down the hallway, trying not to make a sound. Jessica and Mark's room was dark, the door shut. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should wake her mother, but the memory of her mother's tired eyes and frustrated voice held her back. Jessica wouldn't believe her, not anymore. Instead, Abigail quietly made her way downstairs to the lobby. Her small footsteps echoed through the empty hallways as she hugged her arms tightly around herself. The lobby was quiet, only the faint hum of the building breaking the silence. But Abigail wasn't alone. Mr. Davis was sitting behind the front desk, his stern face softened by the warm glow of the desk lamp. His gray hair was neatly combed, his eyes serious as they always were. But there was something different about him tonight, something deeper in the way he watched her approach. "Can't sleep?" he asked, his voice low and calm. Abigail shook her head, biting her lip to hold back the tears threatening to spill over. Mr. Davis stood up slowly, walking around the desk to meet her. His movements were deliberate, careful, as if weighed down by something heavy. He looked at her for a long moment, then gestured toward the quiet lounge. "Let's sit for a while." Abigail followed him into the lounge, sitting down on one of the old, worn chairs. Mr. Davis sat across from her, his gaze steady, almost as if he was trying to read her thoughts. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, like the air was holding back secrets too painful to reveal. Finally, Abigail spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I keep hearing it, the voice, it's calling my name." Mr. Davis didn't flinch. His eyes, deep and knowing, remained on her. "You've heard it before." Abigail nodded slowly, her hands gripping the edge of her chair. "At home too. In the dark. And here, it's worse. It's always there, watching me." There was a long pause. Mr. Davis leaned forward slightly, his eyes darkening. "You're not imagining it, Abigail." Her breath caught in her throat. She looked at him, startled by his words. "What do you mean?" He sighed, leaning back in his chair, his shoulders heavy. For a moment, he didn't say anything, as if weighing how much he could tell her. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, almost haunted. "When I was younger, I made mistakes. I hurt people. People who trusted me." His gaze dropped, as though the weight of his past was too much to bear. "I thought I could leave it behind. But some things, they follow you. No matter where you go." Abigail listened, her heart pounding. She didn't fully understand what he was saying, but the sorrow in his voice chilled her. "What did you do?" Mr. Davis looked at her, his expression grave. "I was involved in something bad, Abigail. Something that hurt a lot of people. I was never caught, but I've carried it with me every day since. And now, I think it's coming back." Abigail swallowed hard, her mind racing. "The voice, it's because of what you did." Mr. Davis nodded slowly. "Maybe. Or maybe it's something else. But whatever it is, it's dangerous. And it's not just after me. It's after you too." A cold shiver ran down Abigail's spine. She looked around the empty lounge, feeling the weight of the darkness pressing in on them. "Why me?" Mr. Davis sighed again, rubbing his hands together as though trying to find the right words. "I don't know, Abigail. But I've seen this before. People, they carry things with them. Guilt, fear, anger. It draws things in, things that feed on that darkness. And if you're not careful, they'll never leave you alone." Abigail's heart raced as the reality of his words sank in. Whatever this was, whatever had been following her, it was real. She wasn't imagining it. And now, it wasn't just her fear, it was Mr. Davis's past too, haunting them both. Suddenly, the quiet of the lounge was broken by a loud bang from the hallway. Abigail jumped, her breath catching in her throat as she looked toward the noise. Mr. Davis's eyes narrowed, his body tensing. "Stay here," he said firmly, rising from his chair. He moved toward the door, his face set in a grim expression. Abigail watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to follow him, but fear rooted her to the spot. Minutes passed in tense silence. Abigail stared at the door, waiting, her breath shallow. And then, just as the tension became unbearable, Mr. Davis returned. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. "It's him," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's Mark." Abigail's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" Mr. Davis shook his head, his eyes filled with a fear Abigail had never seen before. He's not what he seems, Abigail. He's dangerous. And I don't think he's here just to control your mother. I think he's here for you." The words hit Abigail like a punch to the stomach. She stared at Mr. Davis, her mind reeling. Mark, her uncle, her mother's brother, the one person who had always made her feel small, helpless. He wasn't just cruel. He was dangerous. Abigail's hands clenched into fists, her body trembling. She had been afraid of the shadows, of the voice in the darkness. But now, she realized, the real danger had been right in front of her the whole time. The air in the hotel room felt thicker, heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in. Abigail's mind raced, the revelation of Mark's true intentions sinking in like a dark weight pressing against her chest. She sat in the quiet lounge, unable to move, fear tightening around her like a cold, unyielding grip. Mr. Davis's words echoed in her mind, over and over. "He's dangerous. And he's here for you." Abigail had always feared Mark, his cold eyes, his cutting words, the way he could turn her mother against her with just a few soft-spoken sentences. But she had never imagined it was something more sinister than that. Now she knew the truth, and the truth was far more terrifying than the shadows she'd been running from. Mr. Davis stood at the doorway, his back to her, his shoulders tense. His old hands trembled slightly, the weight of his past sins making them shake. He had carried his guilt for years, and now, faced with the monster that was Mark, it was all coming back to haunt him. "I shouldn't have waited this long," Mr. Davis said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have stopped him before it came to this." Abigail's heart pounded in her chest as she looked up at him, her wide blue eyes filled with confusion and fear. "What do you mean?" she asked softly, her voice barely a whisper. Mr. Davis turned to face her, his eyes dark with the burden of what he was about to reveal. "There's something you don't know, Abigail. Something about Mark. Years ago. I knew him. Before he was your uncle. Before he got close to your family." Abigail's breath caught in her throat. "You knew him?" Mr. Davis nodded slowly, his face pale. "He was involved in something terrible. I was too, in a way. I worked at another hotel, back then. He used to stay there, used to do business with people who weren't good. Things went wrong, people got hurt, and I helped cover it up. I thought I could live with the guilt, but it's followed me ever since." Abigail's stomach churned. Mark had always been distant, cold, and manipulative, but she never imagined he had a dark past like this. She felt a shiver run down her spine, her fear deepening. Mr. Davis's voice trembled as he continued. "I thought I'd left it behind, but Mark, he's been using your mother, using your family, for something. And now, he's set his sights on you." Abigail's eyes filled with tears, her small hands shaking as she tried to understand what was happening. "Why? Why me?" Mr. Davis looked down, his voice thick with sorrow. "Because you're the last piece. He's trying to break you, like he's broken everyone else. He wants control, and he'll stop at nothing to get it." Abigail felt her heart tighten, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. She had spent so long trying to get her mother to believe her, trying to make Jessica see the darkness creeping into their lives. But it was more than she had ever imagined. And now, it wasn't just about the shadows or the fear, it was about survival. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Slow, deliberate, and all too familiar. Abigail's breath hitched as she recognized the rhythm. Mark was coming. Mr. Davis turned toward the sound, his face set with grim determination. "Stay here," he whispered, his voice steady now, despite the fear that lingered in his eyes. "I'll handle this." Abigail watched as Mr. Davis moved toward the hallway, his shoulders squared, but there was a sadness in his steps. She could see the guilt that weighed him down, the years of regret that had eaten away at him. He was trying to make amends, trying to protect her now, but Abigail knew deep down that he couldn't do it alone. She stood up, her legs trembling, but her mind sharp. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She had spent too many nights cowering in the dark, too many days feeling small and powerless. Not tonight. Not this time. She followed Mr. Davis into the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and then, Mark appeared at the end of the corridor. His tall figure cast a long shadow against the wall, his face twisted into a smirk that sent a chill down Abigail's spine. "There you are," Mark said, his voice smooth, too calm. His eyes flicked from Mr. Davis to Abigail, a darkness in them that she had never truly seen before. "I was wondering where you'd run off to." Mr. Davis stepped forward, positioning himself between Abigail and Mark. His voice was steady, but his hands shook as he spoke. "It's over, Mark. I know what you've done. I'm not going to let you hurt her." Mark laughed softly, shaking his head. "You think you can stop me? You're an old man, Davis. You couldn't stop me then, and you sure as hell won't stop me now." Mr. Davis stood his ground, but Abigail could see the fear in his eyes. He was trying to be brave, trying to make up for his past, but Mark's presence was overwhelming, suffocating. She could feel the coldness radiating from him, the darkness that seemed to follow him wherever he went. Mark's gaze shifted to Abigail, his smile fading. "You've been a problem, Abigail. Always in the way, always causing trouble. But don't worry, it's almost over." Abigail's heart raced, fear gripping her, but something inside her had shifted. She wasn't going to let him win. She wasn't going to let him take control of her life any longer. She stepped forward, standing next to Mr. Davis, her voice shaking but strong. "You can't control us anymore, Mark. I'm not afraid of you." Mark's eyes narrowed, his smirk disappearing as he stared at her. For a moment there was silence, thick, heavy, the air crackling with tension. And then, Mark lunged forward. But before he could reach her, Mr. Davis moved quickly, grabbing him by the arm. Mark struggled, but Mr. Davis held on, his strength surprising despite his age. "Run, Abigail," he shouted, his voice strained. Abigail hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, but she couldn't leave him. She couldn't run away again. She had to end this. She turned and ran, but not away, toward the room. She grabbed the phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed for help. The seconds felt like hours, her heart pounding in her chest, as the operator answered and Abigail gave the location, her voice quick and desperate. Suddenly, there was a crash from the hallway. Abigail dropped the phone and ran back out, her eyes wide with fear. Mr. Davis lay on the floor, struggling to get up, while Mark stood over him, his face twisted in anger. "Why don't you just give up?" Mark sneered, his voice dripping with cruelty. But then, sirens. The sound cut through the tension, growing louder, closer. Mark's face paled, his eyes darting to the window. He turned to Abigail, his face filled with rage, but now there was something else, fear. He took a step back, glancing at the door. And then, without a word, he ran. Abigail rushed to Mr. Davis's side, helping him to his feet. His face was pale, his body trembling, but there was a look of relief in his eyes. "It's over," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet peace. Tears filled Abigail's eyes as she helped him up, her heart swelling with gratitude and sadness all at once. The police arrived moments later, taking Mark away in handcuffs, his face twisted with anger and defeat. Jessica stood in the doorway, her eyes wide with shock, finally seeing what had been hidden for so long. She rushed to Abigail, pulling her into a tight embrace, tears streaming down her face. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you. I'm so sorry." Abigail held her mother close, her own tears falling, but for the first time in a long while, she felt safe. The shadows were gone, the darkness lifted. They had survived. They had won. As the night turned to dawn, and the hotel grew quiet again, Abigail sat beside Mr. Davis in the lounge. His face was calm now, the weight of his past lifted. He looked at her with a soft smile, his voice gentle. "You're stronger than you know, Abigail." Abigail smiled through her tears, the warmth of the morning light filling the room. She wasn't afraid anymore. The darkness had been defeated, and she knew now that no matter what came next, she would face it head-on. Together, with her mother by her side, Abigail was ready to rebuild her life. The shadows were gone, but the strength they had found in each other would remain.